The courtroom of the New York Supreme Court was thick with tension as whispers gradually faded, leaving behind a heavy silence that settled over everyone present. At the center of this storm stood Nami Carter, a petite 12-year-old girl with neatly braided hair, dressed in a school uniform slightly too big for her slender frame. Her deep brown eyes scanned the crowded room, where dozens of gazes bore down on her, some filled with pity, others laced with cold suspicion. Beside Nami stood Marita Graves, a renowned defense attorney known for her sharp wit and unwavering stance against injustice. She leaned down, whispering gently into Nami's ear. "Stay calm, sweetheart. The truth is on our side." Nami swallowed hard and nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. She stole a glance toward the back of the courtroom, where her parents, Patricia and Jerome Carter, sat anxiously. Her mother clasped her hands together, silently praying, while her father sat upright, his face tense, but his eyes burning with fierce determination to protect his daughter. On the opposite side, Thonson Hale, the assistant district attorney, sat beside Jason Grayson, the officer who had charged Nami. Their demeanor exuded an unsettling confidence, as if the case had already been sealed before it had even begun. Before them, on the prosecution's table, lay the diamond and sapphire necklace, allegedly stolen from Carter and Company jewelry, the sole piece of evidence against Nami. "All rise," the voice of the court clerk echoed, announcing the arrival of Judge Margaret Hensley. The courtroom instantly fell into a solemn hush. A firm, no-nonsense woman with silver-streaked hair and piercing eyes, Judge Hensley took her seat, her presence commanding respect. "We are here today for the trial of the people versus Nami Carter," she declared. The tension in the room became so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. Thonson Hale rose from his seat, straightening his tie before addressing the jury. His voice was smooth, deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we gather for an unfortunate case, one that involves the theft of a $10,000 necklace from Carter and Company jewelry. And the evidence will show, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the culprit is none other than the defendant, Miss Nami Carter." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, with some members of the audience exchanging stunned looks. Hale turned toward Officer Grayson, who sat confidently, unmoved. "We have a key witness, Officer Grayson, who caught the defendant at the scene with the stolen item inside her backpack. Furthermore, the store's security footage will corroborate his testimony. This case is clear, indisputable, and by the time this trial concludes, I trust that you will reach the only logical conclusion, that Nami Carter is guilty." Hale returned to his seat, allowing his gaze to briefly linger on Nami with a look of false sympathy. On the defense's side, Marita Graves rose slowly. She was in no rush, nor did she seem rattled. Instead, she exuded a calm confidence, one that commanded attention. Walking toward the jury, she studied them carefully before speaking. "What you have just heard is a story, a carefully crafted narrative designed to make you believe that a 12-year-old child orchestrated and executed a perfect heist at one of the most secure jewelry stores in Manhattan. A story built not on evidence, but on assumptions." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Remember, justice is not about assumptions. Justice is about truth. And by the time this trial is over, I believe you will see the truth, that Nami Carter is innocent." She returned to her seat, placing a reassuring hand on Nami's shoulder. "Stay strong, Nami. We will fight this to the end." And so, the trial began. The cross-examination begins. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Jason Grayson took the witness stand. His NYPD uniform was impeccably pressed, his badge gleaming under the overhead lights, a symbol of authority he clearly took pride in. His eyes swept across the room before settling on Nami Carter, the 12-year-old girl sitting motionless at the defense table, her small hands gripping the edge of the desk. On the opposite side, Marita Graves watched him carefully. She didn't jot down any notes, nor did she glance at the stack of reports in front of her. She had memorized every detail. She was waiting. Thonson Hale, the assistant district attorney, stepped into the center of the courtroom, his expression grave, as if this case had already been won. Officer Grayson, can you please recount what happened on August 15th when you arrested the defendant, Nami Carter? Jason nodded, clearing his throat before speaking. That afternoon, around 3 p.m., I was patrolling near Fifth Avenue when I received a call from Carter and Company regarding a suspected theft. When I arrived, the store owner, Mrs. Eleanor Carter, pointed out a young girl who appeared suspicious, the defendant. I approached her and asked to check her backpack. Upon opening it, I found the missing necklace inside. He paused, directing his gaze toward the jury. I immediately informed her that she was under arrest on suspicion of theft. She denied any knowledge of the necklace, but the evidence was clear. It was in her backpack. I followed standard procedure and reported the incident. Jason leaned forward slightly, as if expecting agreement from the jury. Thonson Hale paced slowly, nodding approvingly. In your professional opinion, is there any reason to doubt that the defendant stole the necklace? None whatsoever, Jason responded firmly. From the defense table, Marita Graves arched an eyebrow. Time to strike. She rose from her seat, her measured steps echoing across the polished wooden floor. Officer Grayson, she began, her voice calm but razor-sharp. Can you confirm that you were wearing a body camera at the time of Nami Carter's arrest? Jason hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. Yes, I was. Good, Marita nodded. Then why is there no footage from your body camera to support your testimony? A ripple of murmurs spread across the courtroom. Jason's fingers curled tightly around the edges of the witness stand. There was a technical malfunction. The camera didn't record anything. The murmurs grew louder. A seasoned officer just happened to have a technical malfunction at the exact moment he arrested a 12-year-old girl? A technical malfunction? Marita repeated, her tone deliberate. That's interesting, because according to department records, your camera had 0 malfunctions in the 6 months leading up to this incident. Jason stiffened. Marita let the silence hang in the air before continuing, her voice tightening like a noose. Let me rephrase my question, Officer Grayson. Are you absolutely certain that the necklace was in Nami Carter's backpack when you searched it? A bead of sweat formed on Jason's temple. I found it there. Then perhaps you can explain why none of the store employees saw Nami take the necklace? Or why a security officer from a nearby store reported seeing another child leaving Carter and Company at the time of the theft? Jason gripped the edge of the stand, his once unshakable confidence now visibly fractured. Marita didn't need to say another word. She had planted the seed of doubt in the minds of the jury. No further questions, Your Honor. She returned to her seat, placing a reassuring hand on Nami's shoulder. The little girl looked up at her, eyes filled with a renewed sense of hope. The truth begins to unravel. The tension in the courtroom was almost suffocating as Jason Grayson stepped down from the witness stand, his shoulders stiff, his expression betraying a flicker of doubt. Marita Graves' sharp questioning had not only exposed the weaknesses in his testimony, but had also planted the seeds of uncertainty within the jury. At the defendant's table, Nami Carter sat motionless, her small fingers gripping the edge of the desk. She was only 12 years old, but at this moment, She felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, where one wrong verdict could send her into darkness forever. Judge Margaret Hensley surveyed the room before speaking. Prosecution, do you wish to call your next witness? Assistant District Attorney Thonson Hale took a deep breath, attempting to regain control. He rose, buttoned his suit jacket, and faced the court. Your Honor, the prosecution calls our next witness, Mrs. Eleanor Carter, owner of Carter & Company Jewelry. A murmur swept through the courtroom as Eleanor Carter approached the stand. She was the one who had reported the theft. Her testimony could either solidify or completely dismantle the prosecution's case. From the defense table, Marita Graves crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering as Eleanor took a seat. Thonson stepped forward, his voice steady but carrying a hint of strain. Mrs. Carter, can you describe what happened on the day of the alleged theft? Eleanor adjusted her glasses, her voice clear but tinged with hesitation. I was working at the store as usual. It was fairly busy at the time. I noticed a young girl, the defendant Nami Carter, standing near the high-end jewelry display. She seemed nervous, looking around a lot. Did you see her take the necklace? Eleanor pressed her lips together, blinking. No, I didn't see her take it directly, but when the police arrived, they found the necklace in her backpack. That says everything, doesn't it? A calculated pause. Marita leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but razor sharp. Mrs. Carter, you stated that you did not witness Nami taking the necklace, yet you claim she is guilty. Why? Eleanor swallowed hard. I just assumed. You assumed? Or did you simply take Officer Jason Grayson's word for it without verifying the facts yourself? A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Judge Hensley banged her gavel. Order in the courtroom! Marita remained silent for a few moments, letting Eleanor feel the weight of her own words. Mrs. Carter, are you aware that another witness saw a different child, not Nami, leaving your store at the same time as the alleged theft? Eleanor's eyes widened. I wasn't aware. Marita held up a photograph from a nearby security camera. This image shows a person wearing a similar school uniform as Nami, but standing at least 4 inches taller, rushing out of the store. Are you absolutely certain that Nami was the only suspicious individual that day? Eleanor stared at the photo, then glanced at Thonson Hale, but he remained silent. The jury exchanged glances, and even Judge Hensley narrowed her eyes slightly. For the first time since the trial began, Nami Carter felt a glimmer of hope. The trial was far from over, but the truth was finally beginning to emerge. The turning point in court. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom as Jason Grayson stepped down from the witness stand, his once unshakable confidence now fractured. The cracks in the prosecution's case were no longer subtle. They were undeniable. At the defense table, Marita Graves rose slowly, her piercing gaze locking onto Thonson Hale, who was visibly unsettled by the shifting tides of the trial. The defense calls its next witness, Officer July Morales. The courtroom doors opened, and July Morales entered, her uniform pristine, her NYPD badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A veteran officer with over 2 decades of experience, she had worked alongside Jason Grayson for years. As she took the witness stand, she adjusted her badge slightly, her expression unreadable. Thonson Hale tightened his grip on his files, knowing full well that this testimony could unravel his entire case. Marita approached Morales, her voice calm but firm. Officer Morales, how long have you worked with Officer Grayson? July inhaled deeply before responding. About 3 years. We've handled numerous investigations together. During your time working with him, have you ever observed any questionable behavior? A charged stillness filled the courtroom as all eyes fixed on Morales. She hesitated for a brief moment, then nodded deliberately. Yes, Officer Grayson has a pattern of making quick arrests without thoroughly verifying evidence. There have been instances where he detained individuals without fully confirming their identities. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Jason Grayson, seated at the prosecution table, leaned toward Thonson Hale, whispering something, his expression tense. Judge Margaret Hensley tapped her gavel, her sharp gaze cutting through the tension. "Order in the courtroom!" Marita seized the moment, stepping closer to the witness stand. "Officer Morales, based on your experience, is it possible that Officer Grayson acted hastily in this case, jumping to conclusions without sufficient proof?" July Morales hesitated for just a moment before nodding again. "I can't say for certain, but given what I've witnessed in the past, it's entirely possible." The silence in the courtroom became almost deafening. Sitting beside Marita, Nami Carter could feel the shift in the air. For the first time, the weight of the case wasn't pressing down solely on her. The burden was now on the prosecution to prove their claim beyond doubt. Desperate to regain control, Thonson Hale shot to his feet. "Objection! The witness is speculating." Judge Hensley paused, studying Marita before delivering her ruling. "I'll allow it, but let's keep the questioning focused on concrete facts." Marita nodded gracefully, then turned back to July Morales. "Thank you, Officer Morales. No further questions." As Judge Hensley motioned for Morales to step down, the jury members exchanged glances, the uncertainty now evident on their faces. For the first time, the prosecution's case appeared fragile. For the first time, Nami Carter felt a real chance at justice. But Marita Graves knew that they needed more, one final piece of irrefutable evidence to shatter the case completely. The fight was far from over. The case begins to crumble. The courtroom hung in silence as Eleanor Carter's hesitant words echoed through the space. I don't know anymore." That single sentence was enough to send shockwaves through the prosecution's case. Thonson Hale clenched his fists, and Jason Grayson shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the narrative they had built was falling apart. At the defense table, Nami Carter remained frozen, hardly believing what she had just heard. Beside her, Marita Graves allowed herself a brief, victorious exhale before straightening her posture. She had struck a critical blow, but she wasn't finished yet. Judge Margaret Hensley cleared her throat and turned toward the prosecution. "Mr. Hale, do you wish to cross-examine the witness?" Thonson Hale hesitated for a moment before standing up, adjusting his tie. He needed to regain control quickly. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his tone firm, "isn't it true that despite this photograph, we still have clear evidence that the stolen necklace was found inside Nami Carter's backpack?" Eleanor Carter nodded slowly. "Yes, it was found there." Thonson turned toward the jury, seizing the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot ignore the fact that the stolen item was in the defendant's possession. Regardless of who else may have been in the store, the necklace was with her when Officer Grayson arrived." A murmur spread through the audience. Marita knew this was their last major hurdle. She stood up before Judge Hensley could dismiss the witness. "Your Honor, may I redirect?" Judge Hensley nodded. "Proceed." Marita turned back to Eleanor Carter, her voice steady. "Mrs. Carter, I'd like to clarify something. Earlier, you stated that you did not personally witness Nami take the necklace." Eleanor hesitated before nodding. "That's correct." Marita took a slow step forward, her eyes locked onto the witness. "Did you personally see anyone place the necklace into her backpack?" Eleanor blinked. "No." "So then, How can you be certain that she was the one who stole it? Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it again. She was out of answers. Marita turned sharply, now addressing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we've seen a pattern in this case. Assumptions without evidence. First, Officer Grayson assumed Nami stole the necklace simply because it was found in her backpack. Then, Mrs. Carter assumed Nami was guilty simply because the police told her so. But assumptions are not proof. She gestured toward the screen displaying the grainy image of the mysterious figure leaving the store. And now, we have a photo that suggests someone else, someone taller, someone unidentified, was at the scene just before the police arrived. She let the weight of her words settle before delivering her final question. Is it truly justice to convict a 12-year-old child based on assumptions? The room was silent. No one had an answer. Judge Hensley turned to Thomson Hale. Mr. Hale, does the prosecution wish to present any additional witnesses? Thomson looked at his files, then at Jason Grayson, who refused to meet his gaze. He exhaled sharply and shook his head. No, Your Honor. A small gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hensley folded her hands. Very well, we will proceed to closing arguments. For the first time since the trial began, Nami Carter allowed herself to hope. The battle wasn't over yet, but the truth had finally started to emerge. Justice begins to shift. A tense silence blanketed the courtroom as Raymond Harris stepped down from the witness stand. His testimony had been damning, and the prosecution's case was now hanging by a thread. At the defense table, Nami Carter sat rigid, her small hand still gripping the table's edge. But for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Judge Margaret Hensley exhaled, glancing toward Thomson Hale. Mr. Hale, does the prosecution have any further witnesses? The assistant district attorney hesitated, exchanging a sharp glance with Jason Grayson, who sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. Hale flipped through his notes, clearly searching for something, anything that could patch up the gaping holes in their argument. But he found nothing. Slowly he stood, adjusting his tie as he turned to the judge. No further witnesses, Your Honor. A hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom. This was it. Judge Hensley nodded. Very well. We will now proceed to closing arguments. The final stand, Thomson Hale rose first, his face set with thinly veiled frustration. He walked toward the jury, his steps slow and deliberate, attempting to rebuild their trust. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget the core facts of this case. He gestured toward Nami Carter. Regardless of the video footage, the stolen necklace was found in her backpack. He paced slightly, his voice level but pressing. Coincidence? A mistake? Perhaps. But the fact remains that no other suspect has been identified, and Nami Carter was the only individual still present when the police arrived. He turned toward them, his tone shifting. Justice demands certainty. It demands accountability. And while doubt may exist, the question remains, who had possession of the stolen item? He let the weight of his words sink in, then returned to his seat. Now, it was Marita Graves' turn. She stood, calm but commanding, her sharp eyes sweeping over the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about certainty. She took a slow step forward. What we know for certain is this. The prosecution's entire case is built on an assumption that a 12-year-old girl, who was never seen stealing anything, somehow had the stolen item planted in her backpack. An assumption that ignored key details, like the unknown individual caught on camera fleeing the scene. She gestured to Raymond Harris's evidence, then turned back to the jury. Let's ask ourselves, who benefits from assumptions? Who benefits from rushing to a conclusion before all the facts are in? She turned, eyes now locked onto Jason Grayson, who shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. The reality is this. Nami Carter was an easy target, a child, a girl of color, a convenient scapegoat for a system that too often jumps to conclusions rather than seeking the truth. A heavy stillness filled the air. The jury was listening. If justice is about certainty, then I ask you, are you certain she is guilty? Are you willing to convict a child based on nothing but flawed assumptions and circumstantial evidence? She let the silence linger, then took a step back. The answer is clear. Nami Carter is innocent. With that, she sat down. A moment passed. Then Judge Hensley turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you will now deliberate. As the jury exited the courtroom, Nami Carter's fate hung in the balance. But one thing was undeniable. The prosecution's case was crumbling, and the truth was finally emerging from the shadows. Under the harsh glow of the courtroom lights, tension filled the air as the final pieces of evidence brought the case to its climax. 12-year-old Nami Carter sat frozen in the defendant's chair, her wide eyes fixed on the judge, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope amid the wrongful accusations that had threatened to destroy her life. Judge Margaret Hensley leaned forward, her sharp gaze sweeping across the courtroom before speaking with firm authority. Has the jury reached a verdict? The 12 jurors exchanged glances, silent yet resolute. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with graying hair, rose to his feet. Yes, Your Honor, we have. A hush fell over the courtroom. Prosecutor Jason Grayson clenched his jaw, his expression dark as he watched the case slip from his grasp. Officer Thonson Hale, who had been so certain of Nami's guilt, sat stiffly, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. Judge Hensley gave a curt nod. The jury will read the verdict. The foreman took a deep breath before announcing, loud and clear, after carefully considering all presented evidence and testimony, we, the jury, find the defendant, Nami Carter, not guilty. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, an eruption of emotion swept through the courtroom. A gasp of relief, the muffled sound of Patricia Carter, the defendant's mother, sobbing as she pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. Nami sat in shock, her mind struggling to process the words. She turned to Marita Graves, her fierce defense attorney, who stood composed, her eyes sharp yet carrying the smallest trace of a victorious smile. Jason Grayson's face was stone cold, his grip tightening around the documents in front of him. Thonson Hale lowered his head, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Judge Hensley struck her gavel once more. This court finds the defendant free of all charges. Case dismissed. Nami stood, and the moment she stepped away from the defendant's chair, she was immediately enveloped in her mother's arms. Her father, Jerome Carter, rested a hand on her shoulder, his eyes glistening with emotion. She had endured a nightmare, but at long last, justice had prevailed. Marita Graves stepped forward, resting a reassuring hand on Nami's shoulder. "You did well," she murmured. Nami looked up at her, gratitude shining in her young eyes. "You saved me." Marita simply smiled. She didn't need to hear thanks. All that mattered was that justice had been served. As they stepped out of the courtroom, the warm afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the face of Nami Carter, a girl who had been falsely accused but had finally reclaimed her freedom. The jury had returned to the courtroom. The air was thick with tension, the silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Nami Carter sat motionless, her small hands gripping the edge of the table, her palms cold and clammy. Across from her, Officer Thonson Hale clenched his jaw, his eyes avoiding contact. Prosecutor Jason Grayson adjusted his tie, but the confidence he had exuded at the beginning of the trial had long since vanished. Behind Nami, her parents, Patricia and Jerome Carter, held hands tightly as if praying was the only thing left they could do. Marita Graves, the defense attorney, stood tall. She had fought for every second of this trial, tearing apart every false testimony, exposing every gap in the prosecution's case. But she knew that, in the end, the decision was not in her hands. Judge Margaret Hensley struck her gavel, her voice firm yet composed. "Jury, have you reached a verdict?" The jury forewoman, a middle-aged woman with steady eyes, stood. She took a deep breath before reading the verdict aloud. "In the case of the people of New York versus Nami Carter, we, the jury, find the defendant." The entire room held its breath. "Not guilty." For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. No one dared to believe what they had just heard. Then Patricia Carter broke into sobs. She covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. Jerome could do nothing but pull her into an embrace, closing his eyes as if, finally, they could breathe again after enduring a never-ending storm. Nami Carter's eyes widened, her mind blank. She turned to Marita Graves, who leaned down with a warm, reassuring smile. "You did it, Nami," she whispered. And then, as the realization hit, Nami Carter burst into tears. But not everyone was celebrating. At the prosecution's table, Jason Grayson let out a long sigh, his disappointment evident. Thonson Hale sat frozen, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He knew that this case wasn't just a loss, it was the end of his career. Judge Hensley struck her gavel once more, reclaiming the room's attention. "Officer Thonson Hale, this court finds your actions to be ethically questionable. I will be filing a request for an internal investigation regarding your conduct in this case." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. For the first time, Thonson Hale's expression changed. He lifted his head, his face pale. "Court is adjourned," Judge Hensley declared. Outside the courthouse, a swarm of reporters had already gathered. The doors swung open, and Nami Carter and her family stepped out into a flurry of flashing cameras. Voices shouted from all directions. "Nami, how do you feel right now? Mrs. Carter, do you believe justice was served?" Marita Graves placed a steady hand on Nami's shoulder, gently guiding her through the chaos. When they finally made it into their car, no one spoke for a long moment. Nami stared out the window, watching the world outside blur past. Finally, she broke the silence. "I'm really free now, aren't I?" Jerome placed his hand over hers, squeezing it gently. "You've always been free, sweetheart. We just had to remind the world of that." Nami Carter smiled. For the first time in weeks, she felt light, and for the first time in her life, she knew her voice had power. After everything she had endured, she understood that today was not just her victory. It was a victory for others like her. Children misjudged because of their skin color, their circumstances, or a flawed system that was never built for them. Her parents, Patricia and Jerome Carter, stood close. Patricia clutched her daughter's hand tightly, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Jerome, though quiet, carried a look of deep, unspoken pride in his eyes. But there was still one more person who hadn't spoken. Across the street, Thonson Hale stood stiffly, his shoulders rigid, his eyes dark with something unspoken. He had lost everything, his reputation, his career, and now even the confidence he once carried. Nami met his gaze. She didn't need to say anything. The truth had spoken for her. Justice had already given its verdict. Marita Graves glanced at Nami, reading the thoughts in her eyes. "Let's go," she said softly. The Carter family stepped into their car, the door shutting behind them, sealing them away from the noise of the outside world. For a moment, time seemed to slow. They had fought. They had won. That evening, the family sat together in their small home. No more fear, no more uncertainty. Only the warmth of love and the quiet comfort of knowing they had survived. Nami sat by the window, gazing out at the stillness of the night. Outside, the world kept turning, but inside, she felt a peace she never thought she'd find again. Her father walked over, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" Nami nodded. "I think so." He sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "Today, you did something not many people can do," he said, his voice steady. "You stood for the truth, even when it wasn't easy. I'm proud of you." Nami smiled. For the first time since it all began, she felt seen. She felt heard, and she knew this was just the beginning. She reached for a notebook on the table, her pen gliding across the blank page. "Dear Marita, thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Thank you for fighting for me. Because of you, I now understand that justice isn't some distant ideal. It's something we have to defend every day. I promise that one day, I'll do the same." She put the pen down, taking a deep breath. Outside, the first rays of morning sunlight crept over the horizon. And Nami Carter knew that tomorrow she would walk forward stronger than ever before. The lesson from Nami Carter's story. Nami Carter's journey is not just about justice, it is about resilience, truth, and the power of believing in what is right. She was falsely accused, abandoned by a system that was supposed to protect her, but she refused to give in. She understood that justice is not something freely given, it is something we must fight for. Her story reminds us that truth may be buried, but it can never be erased. It will always find its way to the light, as long as someone is willing to stand up for it. Her story also highlights how prejudice can destroy lives. A single false assumption, a moment of bias, nearly stripped a young girl of her future. It forces us to reflect on how we judge others and how crucial it is to seek truth before making conclusions. But above all, the greatest lesson is the power of courage. Without Nami's determination, without Marita's unwavering belief, the truth might never have come to light. Their fight was not just about clearing Nami's name, it was about setting a precedent, ensuring that those who come after her would not have to endure the same injustice. Justice can be shaken, but it will never fall, so long as there are those willing to defend it. And that is why, no matter how cruel the world may seem, people like Nami Carter will always rise to fight. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.